There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives when you finally see something that was always there, but that nobody had pointed to directly. Not new information, the information was available. Not new intelligence, you had the intelligence to process it. Just the specific experience of having something named plainly for the first time in language that connects directly to your own situation rather than to a generalized principle that could apply to anyone. That moment of specific clarity, in my experience, is rarer in financial conversations than in almost any other serious domain of adult life. Not because the truths are hidden or complex, because the conversations that would produce it are systematically avoided by institutions with commercial incentives to avoid them, by advisors with relational incentives to avoid them, and by individuals with psychological incentives to avoid them. And the people who pay the highest price for that systematic avoidance are people over 50, because they are at the stage of financial life where the cost of comfortable vagueness accumulates most visibly in outcomes. My name is William Grant, and the revelation I want to build today, carefully, with the specificity that actually makes it useful rather than merely interesting, is about a single truth that most people over 50 have never heard stated plainly in a financial context, even though everything it requires to understand is already available to them. The truth is this: the financial life you have right now is almost certainly not the result of a plan. It is the result of a series of defaults, products accepted rather than chosen, arrangements maintained rather than reconsidered, structures that persisted because nothing forced a change, and the cost of the existing situation was never made precise enough to motivate one. And the distinction between a financial life built through defaults and one built through deliberate decisions is not primarily a distinction in the intelligence or discipline of the person involved. It is a distinction in the quality of information they had available to them and the quality of the framework they used to evaluate it. This truth has several layers that I want to open carefully, because each layer produces a different and specific implication. The first layer is about how financial products enter a person's life. The overwhelming majority of financial products that people over 50 currently hold were not selected through a comparative process in which the person reviewed alternatives, understood the complete cost structure of each, and made an explicit choice among options based on their specific needs and objectives. They were acquired through one of three mechanisms: a recommendation from a banking or insurance relationship at a moment when the path of least resistance was to accept, an employer-provided structure that was defaulted into rather than actively selected, or a decision made at an earlier life stage and never revisited as circumstances changed and better alternatives became available. None of these acquisition mechanisms is inherently wrong. All of them produce the same structural outcome: a financial life whose components were determined more by who offered them and when than by what would genuinely serve the person's specific retirement objectives. The practical consequence is that most people over 50 are paying costs in fees, in below-market deposit rates, in insurance premiums that have not been compared to current market alternatives, that they would not pay if they had selected each component through a competitive process with full information. These costs are not illegal. They are not even unusual. They are the ordinary result of a financial system designed to distribute products through relationship channels and maintain those relationships through the inertia that familiarity produces. I want to ground this in a specific story, because specificity is what makes abstract patterns recognizable in one's own situation. A man named Percival came to see me at 64, an architect who had spent his career designing buildings with the precision and intentionality that his profession required. Percival was not financially naive. He had managed a practice, understood contracts and liability, handled project budgets of significant complexity. His personal financial life, however, had been managed on a completely different basis from the professional standards he applied to everything else he built. He had an insurance-linked investment product purchased in his early 40s that he had never examined since. He had a savings account at a bank he had used for 30 years, earning a rate he had never compared to alternatives. He had a pension from an earlier employer that he had stopped contributing to and moved to a managed account whose fees he could not name precisely. He had life insurance from a broker who had been his college roommate and whose premiums he had paid without question for 2 decades. When I asked Percival to describe what process he had used to select each of these, he gave an answer I have heard in some variation from virtually every client I have ever worked with. He had not selected them. He had acquired them. The distinction, when he heard it stated that way, was the first moment in the conversation when his posture changed. What Percival and I did together over the following year was not complex in any individual component. It was systematically unglamorous, the financial equivalent of going through the building plans of a structure that had been added to over decades without an architect, identifying what had been built well and what had been built by convenience, and making the repairs and adjustments that an honest evaluation produced. Every product examined against the question of whether it would be selected today through a competitive process. Every cost made precise in annual dollar terms rather than annual percentage terms, because annual dollar terms are what make costs feel real. Every arrangement compared to what the same function would cost from a provider competing for the business rather than benefiting from the relationship. The results were not dramatic in any single item. In aggregate, across 5 components of Percival's financial life, the gap between what he was currently paying and what the same functions would cost through competitive selection was several $1,000s per year, money that had been flowing to institutions and intermediaries rather than to his financial position, not because anyone had deceived him, but because no one had ever handed him a comparison, and he had never asked for one. The second layer of the revelation is about spending, and this layer is the one that most people find most personally uncomfortable, which is precisely why it is the most important one to be direct about. The monthly expenditure structure of most people over 50 was not designed. It accumulated, one decision at a time, across decades in which each individual decision was made in isolation, without reference to a comprehensive picture of what the whole was costing. Subscriptions that were started and never canceled, services that were convenient when life was more complex and are now simply continued by inertia, insurance coverage calibrated to an earlier life stage and never recalibrated, habits of spending in specific categories that were formed in a social context that may have shifted considerably. None of these individual items is outrageous. None of them individually would survive the question, do I still need this at this price, given what is available as an alternative? And yet they persist because the question is never asked systematically and at once about the complete picture. The money recoverable through a methodical and honest audit of monthly recurring expenditure for most people over 50 is not trivial. It represents a meaningful redirection of capital from passive consumption to active deployment, from maintaining the momentum of decades of accumulated decisions to funding the financial priorities of the decade ahead. The third layer is the one that I believe is both the most important and the most consistently unspoken. It is about the relationship between time, honesty, and action. The honest truth about time after 50 is that it is both more limited and more available than the standard financial narrative suggests. More limited because the window of peak earnings, reduced competing demands, and high capital efficiency, the specific combination of conditions that creates the most favorable environment for deliberate wealth building, is a defined period, not an indefinite one. Every year within that window that passes without deliberate action is a year that does not return. More available because the same honesty about the situation that produces this sense of urgency also reveals that the resources to respond to it are genuinely present, that the gap between current position and a substantially improved position 10 years from now is not determined by circumstances outside your control, but by decisions within your control that have simply not yet been made. Percival, at our final meeting, described the experience of the prior year with a precision that I found characteristic of how architects think. He said that what he had done was survey the structure he had built over 30 years and make it fit for purpose for the occupancy conditions of the next 30. Not tear it down, not start over. Survey it honestly, identify what was serving him and what was serving others at his expense, and make the changes that the honest survey produced. That formulation, fitting the structure for purpose rather than accepting the accumulation of decades without examination, is the most practical description I have encountered of what the honest financial truth, acted upon, actually produces. The invitation I want to extend is not to feel alarmed by any of this. It is to allow the specific clarity I have been describing to locate itself in your own situation. Where are the products you hold that you did not select through comparison? Where are the costs you pay in annual dollar terms that have never been made precise enough to feel real? Where is the recurring expenditure that would not survive a systematic review? The answers to those questions, pursued honestly and acted upon deliberately, are the mechanism through which a financial life built through default becomes one built through decision. And that transition, made at 52 or 57 or 61, changes what exists at 65 in ways that are as real and as consequential as any investment return.